Kentucky.
I think it is interesting, the debate we're having, and an important debate. And it is important to call attention to how we spend money in Washington and how the system is irrevocably broken. And we can cast blame where we want to cast blame. But I think for the record, it's important to know that I've been offering all day to vote. I would like nothing more than to vote. But it's the other side. It's the leadership that has refused to allow any amendments. So we have what's called a closed debate. There will be no amendments. There will be no questioning of the authority. And the deal was made in secret. And the deal will not be debated on the floor, and there will be no amendments. So what I'm advocating for is one, that we should reform the process. I don't advocate for shutting the government down, but neither do I advocate for keeping it open and borrowing $1 million a minute. In fact, the statistics this year are now closer to $2 million a minute. This is a government that is horribly broken. This is a system that is horribly broken. And senator after senator will come up quietly and they will say, oh, this is the last time I'm voting for a continuing resolution. This is terrible. This is a terrible way to run the government. This is a rotten way to run the government. And yet, they keep voting for it. They're in charge. Why have we been doing this for 40 years? 4 times in 40 years have we actually done our job, where we voted on each individual appropriation bill. Earlier today, I went through some of the waste. It's amazing the waste that's going on. William Proxmire was first pointing out this waste in 1968. One of the examples he pointed to was that money was being spent studying why men fall in love with women. Now, you may be curious as to that, and if you are, ask your friends to get a crowdsourcing, and you can go study why men fall in love with women, but that's not a function of government. But that waste goes on decade after decade after decade, and nothing is ever fixed. So what we have is a 700-page bill that will not have been read by anything. I was just reading some of the things that are stuck in there that nobody have any idea how they got in there. 700 pages. All of the spending glommed together in one bill with no oversight. This is a terrible, rotten, no good way to run your government, and it's been going on decade after decade, and everyone admits it's a terrible, rotten, no good way to run your government, and yet nobody stands up and says enough's enough. They say it's a binary choice, young man, take it or leave it. Well, I'll leave it. I don't want to shut down government, but somebody ought to insist that we have an open amendment process. Someone should insist that we root out waste in government. We've had a partial audit of the Pentagon, and we found out that $800 million was misplaced or lost. What's been done so far on the audit showed over $100 billion has been wasted in the Pentagon. And so what do? We reward them with more money. We've been trying to get a complete audit of this Pentagon for 17 years, and you know what they argue? They say, well, we're too big to be audited. How galling is that, when your government tells you that we are too big to be audited? This goes on decade after decade after decade. Everybody in Washington complains about it. All the constituents complain about it. All of America complains about it, and yet we do it time after time. And then people say, well, look, this is a bipartisan deal. Kumbaya. Republicans and Democrats are holding hands to spend more money. Well, it's the opposite of what you want. You want compromise in Washington, but we should be compromising to spend less money, not more. Every one of the Republicans, count them, you can look it up on the internet, every one of the Republicans said that Barack Obama, President Obama, was a spendthrift and he had trillion-dollar deficits, and we railed day in, day out, year in, year out against it. Rightfully so. It was too much debt and too much spending. We were against that. That's what I ran for office on. But I'm not about to turn my head the other way and say, oh, it's fine because my party's doing it. That's what this is about. It's pure, empty partisan politics where people are saying, oh, it's okay for Republicans to have debts, but it was bad for Democrats to have debts. Now it's time we stood up and said it's a rotten system, and it should end. How will it end? It's never going to end by people always passing the buck and saying, oh, I'm voting, this is my last continuing resolution. I hate continuing resolutions. They're terrible. This is my last one, but I'm going to vote for one more. And maybe next year, or actually in a month, because we'll be doing this again in a month. You realize we're on our fourth continuing resolution. This has nothing to do with the budget, and the media kind of confuses us. They say we have a budget deal. No, we have a continuing resolution deal. This is not a budget. This isn't some sort of plan. This hasn't gone through a committee. There's no appropriation bills that are going through committee. There's no oversight happening to your government. And so when I tell you that $356,000 was spent last year studying why what happens to Japanese quail when they're on cocaine, are they more sexually promiscuous on cocaine? This is what your government's spending money on, but it doesn't get any better because we never root out the waste. In fact, the agency that's been doing this research ends up getting more every year. They're like, oh, we like science. Well, if you like science, you'll like this one. They took $700,000 from autism research and they spent it studying what Neil Armstrong said when he was on the moon. Did he say one small step for man, or did he say one small step for a man? We spent $700,000 studying whether the preposition a was in Neil Armstrong's statement. $700,000 that should have been spent on autism. So this isn't really just about fiscal conservatism, although it is. It's also about how best to spend money for legitimate expenses. Every time you spend money in a wasted way, you're taking it away from something that presumably was less wasteful. So this is a big deal. Do I want to shut down government? No. But do I want to keep it open and not reform it? Hell no. That's what's going on. $1 trillion deficit this year. It's going to be bigger probably. But we were approaching $1 trillion before they added $300 billion new spending to this. So this is a problem. This is a big deal. And what I've said all day long, I'll vote all day long. Start the process, open the doors. We could have had 40 amendments today. We've been at this all day with the other side blocking amendments, trying to have no debate, and trying to close the door so a secret deal, a deal done in secret, can be forced on everyone else. So yes, we should have debate. Yes, we should have a vote. Let's have a vote tonight on amendments. Let's have amendments. Let's determine whether the American people or the Senate are really in favor of busting the caps. I have one amendment. I'm not asking for a dozen amendments. I'm not asking for 100 amendments. I'm not asking for 1,000 amendments. I'm asking for one. It takes 15 minutes. So realize these people all day that want to paint a picture, one, they're embarrassed, and I understand that. They are embarrassed by this situation because they know the hypocrisy is thicker than pea soup. They know the hypocrisy is out there. They know they railed and they railed and they railed against President Obama's debt. $1 trillion deficits. Every one of them railed against it, and now they're going to have to vote tonight for $1 trillion deficit. So that is the problem here. And so there is a certain embarrassment to bring this up. And so the embarrassment causes them to say, we don't want any amendments. We're not going to have any amendments because we don't want to discuss this. It really ought to be discussed. And so much more should be discussed. It isn't just that we're blocking amendments or debate on spending, or that we're not doing our job on appropriations bills. We're also not doing our constitutional duty on the declaration of war. You know, this was something that the Founding Fathers were explicit on. The power to declare war was given to Congress. Section 1, Article 1, Section 8, given to Congress. In fact, there's discussion of this. There was extensive discussion of this. Almost every Founding Father weighed in on the fact that war should be declared by the legislature. Madison put it this way. He said that the executive branch is most prone to war. Therefore, with studied care, that power was vested in the legislature. When's the last time we declared war? Well, officially, we haven't declared war since World War II, but we sort of voted, at least we came to Congress, at least George Bush came to Congress when we went to Afghanistan the first time and we went to Iraq the first time. And there were votes. But these votes were long ago, nearly a generation ago, and they really don't apply to anything we're doing now. And there's a certain intellectual dishonesty to those who continue to say that the vote to go into Afghanistan has anything to do with what we're doing over there now. There is no military solution there, and that also ties into our budgetary problems. We do not have enough money to build nations around the world and think that we can build our nation here at home. So when people talk about nation building, I say, yeah, you're right, but we need to do some nation building here. The president has talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, but there's no money for it. So look, we're borrowing $1 trillion before we get started on people advocating for a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. There is no money. And so if we want to find the money, we have to make difficult choices. As people come to my office and they say, we want money for X, we want money for Y, we want money for Z, I listen carefully, I listen sympathetically, and I try to say, look, we're a rich country. We ought to be able to do what you're asking me, and yet we have a $1 trillion deficit. That everything has to be reflected by the fact that we are out of money and horribly spending a great excess of what comes in. But nobody's making these difficult choices because we just keep adding on to the tab. We basically just borrow more money. So when President Obama was president, we were, under George W. Bush, we went sort of $5 trillion to $10 trillion for the total debt. Under President Obama, we went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. We're on sort of that same curve again. In fact, we may be escalating that curve as we speak. But that enormous debt, we all criticized as Republicans and said it was a bad thing for your government. And there was a debt commission, and there was all of this discussion and a lot of hand-wringing. And I was one of those. I was concerned, but still am concerned. So we have this debt that continues to escalate, and yet what do Republicans do when they are in charge? You remember the stories. If you were asked to help Republicans, they said, well, we took over the House, but now we control 1/3 of government. We can't get everything we want. So it didn't happen. And then we took over the Senate, and we controlled 1/3 of government. They said, well, we have to have the presidency. And then, lo and behold, we won the presidency. We have all the branches of government, and yet we still are putting forward a spending bill that will be the equivalent of a $1 trillion deficit. Is it wrong to point that out? Is it wrong to want better of your own party? Is it wrong to think that we ought to do our job, that we ought to go into an appropriation process? The House actually did it. People say, oh, we can't do that anymore. The House of Representatives passed all 12 appropriation bills. It can be done. And it's actually maybe not the panacea I would hope, in the sense that there's still too much money being spent even through the appropriation process. So it really needs to go hand in hand with two things. We should do the appropriation bills. 12 departments of government, let's pass them one at a time. But we should also keep in mind as we're spending money or voting to spend money that the Constitution limits very much what the Congress can do. There are enumerated powers given to Congress under Article 1, Section 8. That's what we're supposed to do. And this was a big deal to the Founding Fathers. In fact, they were very specific that those rights not listed were not to be disparaged. So the listing of the Bill of Rights is a partial listing of your rights. But they were also very careful to say that the powers that were granted to the federal government were a complete list, and anything not listed in the powers granted was to be retained by the people in the states, by the states and the people respectively. And that's part of our problem, is we decided we wanted government that was everything to everyone. And you ask yourself, is one party better than the other? Maybe at times, but really, if you're looking for responsibility, they want to cast blame. All of a sudden, I, myself, somehow am responsible for the whole problem up here. Well, actually, I've made them angry. And they're very upset with me because I've, made it difficult. And we're going to have to be up late tonight. And they're angry that I'm pointing out their hypocrisy. And that is a big problem. And nobody likes to have that pointed out. But if we don't, if we just continue on this course, I think there's a great danger to the nation. I think there is a day of reckoning coming. And I think that our debt eventually could get the better of us, that it could really threaten the underpinnings, the undergirdings of our country. And it could do it in a couple different ways. For some time now, we have manipulated interest rates through the Federal Reserve. We've kept them below market rate. This led to a huge housing bubble and a housing correction. We don't really have the housing bubble happening, but many of you may have noticed there's been a huge stock market bubble. And there is a question whether that has been fed, and the fury of that has been fed by Fed policy. and whether or not the desire to keep interest rates low to make it cheap to borrow money, whether or not that someday will have a boom that leads to a bust. And I really think that is a worry. The stock market's been very jittery in the last few days, and I think some of that has to do, and it's funny how people interpret it. Some on the left will say, oh, the stock market is jittery because the government might shut down for 2 hours. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. But it could be perhaps that they are jittery because we are a government that is profligate in our spending and is perpetually spending more that comes in and have such a great imbalance that, maybe a third of what we're doing up here is financed. And they say, well, it'd be one thing to actually finance, a house or something like that. But if you're financing your rent or if you're financing your groceries each month, there's a problem. We're having trouble paying our day-to-day expenses because we're borrowing them. Much has been said that the military needs the money. And I believe in a strong national defense. In fact, I believe that our national defense is actually the most important thing that the federal government does. It's one of those things that the state government can't do. And so, yes, I want a strong national defense. But you have to ask yourself whether a $20 trillion debt makes us a stronger country or a weaker country. I think it was Admiral Milliken who said that the number one threat currently to our country is our national debt. There is this question of whether or not an insolvent nation can be a strong nation. So as we look through this, I think it'd be wise that we would look at this spending bill and say, this is not the way we should run our government. And we as Republicans, if we really truly are conservative, we should be putting forward something that's looking towards balance at the very least, instead of going in the opposite way. So I would ask the Senate to really take a look at themselves, look in the mirror and say, is this really what we stand for? Is this what we've been running for all these years, to control government and then be no different than our counterparts across the aisle? So today, I think, is a day of reflection, but hopefully a day in which there will be some who will say, enough's enough, I'm not going to do it anymore.